So we're going to have Howard come back up here again, and what's significant about the juxtaposition between Mark and Howard is that when Howard was born, there were horses and buggies on the street, and in the kitchen there was an icebox. And today we have cars that park themselves and robots that are wandering around Mars. So, Howard, it's great of you to come up here and give us a little talk about what you're up to.
Thank you so much. You're quite right. My father had a Model T.
So, carry on.
Well, good morning, all. It's a great pleasure to see you all. This is going to be possibly a trip down memory lane, because most of you are too young to know what I'm talking about in 1920. Some of you might be, but you don't admit it. So my career has been really 74 years. I started as a dance band in well, I don't remember. But then the career started in CBC because Percy Faith left Canada for a greater contract in the States. And CBC didn't know how to replace him. So I had a friend, an announcer on CBC who was very, very devoted to big band music. And he loved the big bands of the era, which is, of course, in the 30s. And he had a record collector, and he and I got a good friendship. He saw me working with a band in Kitchener, and he was impressed. So he told the headquarters in CBC to try this guy Cable. He's 19 and he's got talent. So they called me in and gave me a band and had me write a program, an audition program, and they bought it. They engaged me. I succeeded Percy Faith. And I couldn't believe it. I was 21. And they named the program Music by Cable because the previous show was Music by Faith. So that's what happened, how it started. And I'm going to tell you that the career has been many varied. I always conducted, I always wrote, I composed, and the whole 74 years I've done that, so that runs right through everything. But the career has been branches here, branches there. It's 50 years, 5 decades, from the 40s to the 80s. And I'll tell you about the 80s when I finish, how that happened. But it's a capsule of 5 decades. So I'll just tell you how it all happened, because I know you want to hear encouragement words from an old guy, but the old guy has always done 2 things. He has converted every negative into a positive. He's never let negatives interfere with his working and his career. And positivity, adaptability, and versatility, they're quite simple words, but my whole career has been that way. I've adapted. I keep getting ideas. Somebody said, will you do this? And I've never done it before. And I say, why not? Why not? Accept absolutely every idea that you think you can do, and then wrap it up. Research it, do it, and it's a given. That's my feeling. Anyway, we're starting with the 40s. The 40s were completely different in radio. There was no television. 40s and radio were the owner of programs by sponsors, and all the agencies, the ad agencies, were responsible for getting the program. The CBC had the technique. They had the wire, but they didn't control anything in the 40s. The same as in the States. Bob Hope was on for Pepsodent. Edgar Bergen was on for Jason Sanborn. So in Canada, the agencies representing the sponsors did everything. And in the 40s, I was writing, when I wasn't conducting, I was writing for other conductors. We did Goodyear Parade of Song. It was a series on CBC, sponsored by Goodyear. It was Tip Top Music for Canadians, same thing. On CBC, the commercials were all tip top. And then we had three symphonies. Sir Ernest Macmillan was the conductor of the Toronto Symphony. In those days, he was a very important man in music in Toronto, in Canada. But the symphony was always on as the Northern Electric Symphony. This is the Northern Electric Symphony conducted by Sir Ernest Macmillan. This is the Supertest Symphony. Supertest Gasoline sponsored a symphony program, a Pops. And then there was the Simpson, Robert Simpson Company Pops. So it was all to do with identification of sponsors. And the agency would be the in-between person to decide whether the sponsors had ideas, but they didn't really know what they wanted. They had individual things. I don't like that, but I like that. You know, you can never please 100%. You try for 75, but they never get the other 25. But that's what the agencies did. They rode herd on the sponsor. And the sponsor would say, I like this program, but there's too many flutes, and not enough harp, and too much strings. And the agency we'll fix it. And people addicted to Mad Men say, was that the way it was? Yeah, that was the way it was. I was working with agencies the whole time, 40s and 50s. And the only difference between Mad Men and the truth is that there was no sexual overtone. There were women there, and there were lots of women there, and you know, it was a good thing because the guys kind of wandered a little bit, and the women would always bring them up to date. And they'd have a 3-hour lunch and come back, and they'd say, what are we doing today? And the girl would say, that. So it was, I observed not the sexuality in the Mad Men, but the fact that women ran the thing. They really did. They ran the thing. And it was a great experience to work with agencies and do sponsorship, talking about the product. Because nowadays, all the agents, the sponsors buy in 20-second, 30-second. You know, they have 9 commercials in a row. I don't know how that sells anything, but obviously it sells something. But in those days, we had Canadian General Electric. We did 7 years with Canadian General Electric with a beautiful orchestra on Sunday night, and we sold all the small appliances. The whole thing was based on the small appliance division of Canadian General Electric. Toasters, steam irons, all that, the small things. And we're going back a little bit. That was 1948. Let's go back to where I started in 41, 42. I was given this music by Cable, and that created a bit of a stir. They said, you know, who's this guy? What's he doing? And all of a sudden, the war was on, and I was rejected because of my eyesight, and I was available. But Robert Farnan, who was the great arranger-conductor who was in the Happy Gang, and he was the conductor and the music director of Jolly Miller Time on CBC. Now, Jolly Miller Time was sponsored by Maple Leaf Milling, which is now Maple Leaf Foods. But Maple Leaf Milling was the Jolly Miller Time, and Bob Farnan was the director of that. So he would join the Army as head of the Army show with Wayne and Schuster, and he suggested I take over the show. So that put me in view of the agencies. The agencies knew who I was, and all of a sudden, I was important because I was the new kid on the block. This is 1944 and 45. So, as I said, you have to be versatile. You have to take negatives into positives, and I did that all the way through. In 1946, Borden's decided to do a special talent show called Canadian Cavalcade, starring Lorne Greene. That was before Bonanza. He hadn't gone to Ponderosa yet. But he was the big staff announcer at CBC. So it was Canadian Cavalcade with Lorne Greene, sponsored by Borden's with the in-between Young and Rubicam. The Young and Rubicam hired me, and we produced 2 years of really quite, in the 46, I thought was pretty damn good show. We introduced new talent. That was Borden's idea, was to give new talent a chance on the network. The CBC wasn't doing it. They were just a means to broadcast across the country, but it took the sponsors to do it. So Borden's wanted to sponsor new talent. So in 1946, as I remember, in October of 46, we introduced to the very first time on network television across the country a young pianist from Montreal, 21-year-old Oscar Peterson, his first broadcast. And he was wonderful, as we all know what happened to Oscar Peterson, a world-class jazz pianist. Then the next month, we introduced another man from Montreal, 19-year-old Maynard Ferguson, on trumpet. He didn't play the high notes then that he does now, or he didn't. But Maynard Ferguson, that was the idea of Canadian Cavalcade. It was always to produce Canadian talent across the country. Then the next thing happened, as I said, adaptability is always, every orchestra was different. Every instrumentation was different. The sponsor wanted more violins or less harp, more flutes, and you did that. Adaptability was very important. The next thing that happened was Canadian General Electric, which I already referred to. Canadian General Electric wanted a nighttime Sunday night program, which was the so-called good music, restful Mantovani, Kostelanetz type music for Sunday night, closing with a hymn. At 7:30 at night on Sunday night, we had to close with a hymn. So that program went on for 7 years, 5 years on radio, and then 2 years. I'll come to that in a moment. But Canadian General Electric was the sponsor. McLaren's was the agency, and Leslie Bell Singers. Do you remember Leslie Bell Singers? Did anybody here remember Leslie Bell Singers? They were the stars of the show, with Charles Jordan as the baritone soloist and Howard Cable and the orchestra. And that went on every Sunday night for 36 weeks for 7 years. And we had wonderful audiences. People phoned in, wrote back. You know, it was one of those special shows. Again, there was nothing on television. Television hadn't started yet. That's coming up next. We had this wonderful show, and it was right into the 50s. Now, my biggest challenge and the adaptability is really in question in this one, because the Korean War started in 1950, and Department of National Defense in Ottawa, Honorable Brooke Claxton was the Minister of National Defense. And he was very, very excited about having a radio show every week. He wanted a radio show the Army was not in good shape with the Korean War, and he wanted to boost the morale. He wanted to certainly get new soldiers in, and he wanted a real public relations show. And it was to run for 26 weeks for 2 years, sponsored by the Department of National Defense. Brooke Claxton was one of those hands-on sponsors. He didn't let the agency tell you what to do. He wrote the memo and said, I would like that. I don't like that singer, but I like that singer. And that was the way it worked. And that, again, it's adaptability, always converting the negatives into positives. So interestingly enough, Brooke Claxton auditioned, sent out a memo to all the bases. There were 12 Army bands at that point in the country, and he wanted every band to do one week, every Tuesday night, another band. And they all said, we can't do that. We're too busy playing parades and officers' mess, and it's too complicated. So Brooke Claxton called the agency that resembled the Department of National Defense, and there was I can't remember the agency, but the agency called Jack McLaren. McLaren says, what do you do about this? We need a band. We need a band for every week to put military music and pop music. And what have you got there? All right. So we have, all of a sudden I am putting together a band. And I've never written for a band before. I've written for strings and harp and flutes and all of stuff. All of a sudden I have to write for military bands. My own military band, which is civilian band. And we went on the air, and that caused me to write a lot of music. I learned how to write for military bands in 2 months. And it kind of worked because the band was great. Wonderful musicians. The symphony, Toronto Symphony woodwinds, Toronto Symphony brass, and there were no strings. It was just all military. So we had half military and half popular. And we had a wonderful time with the band. And after the war was over, the CBC decided to put the band on Sunday nights as a replacement for Wayne and Schuster. Wayne and Schuster was a radio show at that point, and they put the band on, and the band was heard across the CBC network and also in the States on Mutual Network. And the publishers in New York heard about it, and they started to tune in, and they were sure that there was the Eastman Wind Ensemble, because the publishers in New York, they don't know much about Canada. They thought that Rochester was right across the lake from Toronto, so it must be the Eastman Wind Ensemble from Rochester. No, it wasn't. It was the Cable Concert Band. And so I got a call from Chapel in New York to talk to them about publishing. So I went down to New York on the basis of the band being on, and I was introduced to the president of Chapel, and he said, are you as good as they say you are? And that's, how do you answer that? I said, I hope so. I hope so. Max Dreyfus, he was the president. He was 92 years old, same age I am now. And he was the founder of Harm's music. He was the man who discovered Jerome Kern. He was the man who discovered George Gershwin. And he's talking to me about how I'm as good as I am. So I was very, very honored to be talking to Max Dreyfus. And he signed me up, and they published Newfoundland Rhapsody and my marksmanship and the march from the Korean War and several other things. So I got published in New York on the basis of that broadcast. I didn't even look for it. It was all of a sudden that fell into my lap. Meanwhile, at the same time, television is starting in Canada, 1952. And I wrote the first show. I wrote the music for the first show. The popular part of the show was September of '52. Glenn Gould was the soloist on the first television show. And we had 2 stations. We had Toronto and Montreal. And they flew the kinescope. After Toronto, they flew it to Montreal. And that was a great start of television in Canada. And I was there when it started. Now, the next thing was the hockey night in Canada. And that started with Foster Hewitt in November of '52. And Imperial Oil was the sponsor. And they ran the show. They wanted Happy Motoring to talk about the wonders of Imperial Oil. So they wanted a sports march. They wanted, because the Gillette Cavalcade of Sport was on in the American network, and they wanted something like that. So McLaren Agency, my really home agency, was the one who also had the account for Imperial Oil. So they asked me to write a march to open the hockey night. That march was called Saturday's Game, and it was on for 3 seasons until the beer companies came in and said, marches are corny, we want something other than that. So they scrapped the march, and that was it. But the march was actually a rewrite of one of the marches I'd written for the Korean War, Voice of the Army, because I wrote, Brooke Claxton wanted every corps, every battalion saluted on Voice of the Army. So if they didn't have a regimental march, he said, write one. So I wrote six marches for the various things. And as it turns out, the Saturday's Game was a rewrite of the march for the Dental Corps. That was one of the jokes that the musicians had, the Dental Corps. So that was the story of how I managed to. Would you like to say something?
I would like to ask you, what is the secret to your memory? I mean, for me, yesterday is a blur. And you remember the agencies and the name of the directors and the minutiae and how many episodes, and it's all quite stunning.
I'm very fortunate. I think it has to do with genes and good luck, but it's there. And once I forget the past, I'm done.
I wanted to ask you about some of the famous people that you worked with. You've mentioned a lot of the Canadians, but in the little bit of reading I've done about your career, I noticed that you've worked with Ellington, you worked with Getz, you worked with Jack Benny, with Danny Kaye. What was Peggy Lee like?
Peggy Lee was wonderful, because I was coming to that. I was music director, and this is 30 years after we talked about. I was the music director of the Royal York Hotel, the Imperial Room. And the Imperial Room, in its heyday, had great stars. Ella Fitzgerald came every second year. Tony Bennett came every year. Peggy Lee came every third year. So it was 15 years of musical joy in the Royal York Hotel. So that's how I remember all those great times. And of course, eventually the era finished. I've closed more eras than I think about. I mean, the era of the cabaret disappeared. Right. You know, the stars got too expensive or too sick. Ella stopped coming because she was ill, and the audience were drifting away because they were getting older. We weren't, but they were. And they were drifting away, and they couldn't come out at night. And, you know, so the Royal York Imperial Room sort of spiraled down, and I left in '86. It closed in '87. Right. I was close.
Dare I ask you, what do you think of hip-hop? What do you think of rap?
Once somebody asked me that, and I said, it reminds me of feeding a rhyming dictionary into a corn popper.
All right. I think some of these people need a bio break, Howard, so thank you so much for coming by.
Pleasure.
Are you going to stick around for the rest of the day?
Yeah, we're doing Michael Van Hebel.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So,